But even by their own partisan standards, House Democrats have already found new ways to lower the bar. This is about the most consequential process the House of Representatives could possibly engage in: overruling American voters and nullifying an election. Surely, any such process must be conducted with the utmost fairness and transparency. It must be held to the most exacting of standards. And yet, House Democrats have wasted no time throwing fairness and precedent to the wind.
There's no requirement that we have a vote, and so at this time we will not be having a vote. And I'm very pleased with the thoughtfulness of our caucus in terms of being supportive of the path that we are on, in terms of fairness, in terms of seeking the truth, in terms of upholding the Constitution of the United States.
That's House Speaker Nancy Pelosi last night, standing by her decision not to hold a full House vote right now, despite that Republican criticism you heard from Leader McConnell and others. Meanwhile, now Vice President Mike Pence and Rudy Giuliani joining the ranks of those refusing to hand over documents sought by Congress in the impeachment inquiry. The Vice President's counsel says it's because the inquiry has not been authorized by the House. Giuliani's lawyer says his client will not cooperate because the inquiry appears to be, quote, unconstitutional, baseless, and illegitimate. Meanwhile, the Office of Management and Budget missed yesterday's deadline to turn over documents related to the delay of military aid to Ukraine, and NBC News has just obtained a letter from the Defense Department stating it, too, will not comply with a subpoena for documents, citing in part the lack of House authorization. This comes just days after Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the Pentagon would, quote, do everything we can to comply. Let's bring into the conversation 2020 Democratic presidential candidate and Senator from California, Kamala Harris. Senator, it's great to have you with us. We want to talk about the debate a good bit in just a moment, but let's talk about what's in front of us right now. As a former prosecutor, as someone who has interviewed many of the folks involved here in trying to get to the bottom of what happened with Ukraine, what is your next move here? If you have a White House that has explicitly said we are just not going to cooperate, we're not going to answer subpoenas, what's your recourse?
Well, they should be held in contempt of Congress. Anyone who is refusing to comply with an official act of Congress, and meaning that Congress is acting in its role as oversight and also as a check and balance on the abuse of power by the executive branch. But, Willie, I also have to say, you know, the hypocrisy is just blinding. And, you know, when you have Mitch McConnell, who also was the leader during the years of President Obama, and they would haul before Congress everyone from Eric Holder to Hillary Clinton, all of whom complied, and we had to sit there for hours on end in what was clearly a politically motivated process, but they still complied. And now you have them basically saying that the rules don't apply to them in the way they have tried to hold the Democrats accountable. So it's blatant hypocrisy, and it is obstruction of justice. Let's be clear about this. What we are talking about in terms of this impeachment proceeding, the subject matter includes the president committing a crime in plain sight. It is extraordinary that what we have in terms of evidence, because really it should not take very long to figure it out. We basically have a confession, there is a cover-up, and a consciousness of guilt. But the obstruction of justice by this administration, by Donald Trump, by the Attorney General, by Giuliani, is blinding and really does highlight the need for this impeachment proceeding, because this truly is a moment where justice is on the ballot in America, and we have to fight for that.
So, Senator, with all that in mind, would Speaker Pelosi be wise to hold the vote to make it an official impeachment inquiry, thereby calling the bluff of those who've said, well, we're not going to cooperate because it's not an official impeachment inquiry?
I'm going to leave that to the best thoughts of the Speaker, who I think is brilliant in the way that she conducts herself and does it in a way that appreciates that this is about the very integrity of our system of justice and our democracy, and that this must be conducted in a way that is not about political benefit, but is about what is in the best interest of the integrity of our system, which has been compromised because of Donald Trump and his administration.
Senator, one of your colleagues, your former colleagues, Claire McCaskill's here with a question.
Good morning, Kamala.
Hi, Claire. Good morning.
I thought you were on fire last night. As a fellow former prosecutor, would you do me a favor and walk everyone through what this impeachment process is? I think people are confused about the legal process here, that the House gathers information similar to a criminal investigation, and then there is a proceeding as to whether or not the president will in effect be indicted on impeachment. And then it comes over for a trial. Talk about that and how incredibly fair it is, because all the defense attorneys, which is every Republican in the House of Representatives, is in the hearings. Everything that is going on there, they're witnessing and they're asking questions. I think Americans need to, I think there's a lot of confusion out there about how this actually works. Can you do the analogy to a criminal case and kind of walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it well, Claire. It is. This is right now, the process is a fact-gathering process, and it is about presenting evidence. It is about challenging witnesses. In many situations, it will include cross-examining witnesses to test their credibility, their ability to actually perceive that which they testify about, their bias. All of these things will be on trial, as you said, to determine what are the actual facts in the case. And after the House of Representatives, in a bipartisan process, makes those determinations, if they decide that there is enough to return an indictment, or in this case articles of impeachment, then it will go over to the Senate, where there will be then basically a trial to determine guilt. And I couldn't agree with you more. I hate to just use broad terms to talk about a group of people, but in this case I will. The Republicans in the House they're feigning helplessness, when in fact, over many years, they have participated in coddling the bad behaviors of this president and, frankly, obstructing justice, as we are seeing now, with the unwillingness and, in fact, the refusal to comply with official acts of Congress. And so I think that the American people should recognize that if everyone agrees there should be a fair process, then the witnesses must come forward so that process can actually take place. And then there will be an ability also for the American people to witness this trial and form their own opinions in the process as well.
Senator Harris, let's take a moment to talk about some of the people who helped get Donald Trump elected to the presidency. Most of them, many of them, I bet, were not watching the debate last night. A lot of people with Twitter accounts were watching the debate last night. But the people who helped elect him, if you go out into your home state, I suspect in the Inland Empire, Fresno, Bakersfield, what do you propose if you're president of the United States to people who believe that they have not gotten a fair shake, that they have been ignored by the, quote, elites, and worse, they believe that their children will be ignored? What do you tell people like that to get them back into the process and vote for Democrats?
Well, it's part of why I'm running, Mike. I do believe that we have to unify our country, and we have to understand that the vast majority of us have so much more in common than what separates us. I mean, back to Claire's point, I started my career as a prosecutor where I stood in a courtroom and I said Kamala Harris for the people. And it was not for people of a certain race or gender or ethnic background or party affiliation, or, you know, it didn't matter the language that your grandmother spoke. It was about all the people and representing a voice that's about justice and also understanding the commonalities between us. And going forward, I think that is critically important, because not only are the American people exhausted by what we have seen under Donald Trump, but there has truly been division because of his manipulation of issues. But when you look at issues like health care, the need for people to be able to have a job, and one job that is enough to put food on the table and have a roof over their head, when you look at the need of people to know that their kids, when they go to college, are not going to be burdened with student loan debt, when you look at the need for women to be paid equal for equal work, these are issues that impact all Americans, regardless of their party affiliation, regardless of their race. And we need to have leadership in this country, and the next president who has an ability to see the commonalities between us and use her microphone in a way that is about speaking to that and speaking to who we really are in terms of our collective hopes and dreams, and frankly bringing back and restoring the integrity of the ideals of our country and the American dream. I feel very strongly about that.
Senator Harris, I will get the same texts and emails I always get when you're on this show after this interview or after the debate last night, and people will say to me, I really like her. Boy, she's smart. She represents a huge state. She was a prosecutor. She's got a lot going for her. So how do you explain where you are in the polling right now, and how do you get up from where you are into that top tier?
You know, Willie, I think the challenge for me is that we're still introducing, I'm still introducing myself. There are a lot of candidates on the stage who have been on the scene for decades, and they're well known. And I think it speaks volumes of the fact that a lot of people still haven't made up their mind. And so, I don't know if you heard, I'm virtually moving to Iowa.
Yeah.
After I do this interview.
I did hear that.
I'm actually heading, I'm serious about that. I'm going to Dubuque later today. I'm doing a town hall there this evening, and I am fully prepared to do what is necessary, which is earn the support of people. But the challenge is that people need to know that I'm here and need to know my background and my values, and so I'm prepared to meet that challenge, and I fully intend to win. It will not be easy, and I know we're also challenging certain people's notions of who can do what based on what we've traditionally seen in terms of who can do what, and I know we're asking people to have a vision of what can be, unburdened by what has been. We're asking people to have an image of who can be president based on something they may not have seen before, but can believe in terms of what also represents the future of our country and where we want to go. So there are challenges, but I'm prepared to meet them.
And as you say, there's an awful lot of time between now and those votes in Iowa, and you will be posted up there.
That's right.
We know. Senator Kamala Harris of California, thank you.
Serious about that.
All right. Thank you, Senator.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Coming up next, Senator Bernie Sanders picking up some big endorsements. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar now backing Bernie Sanders. What that may mean for his campaign next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.